everybody. Welcome to another Sunday morning conversation. Today, my guest is Sarah Hellewell. She is a neuroscientist she's in Perth, Western Australia. We have a really good conversation. I learned something about my heart rate issues that I have as an athlete today. So that was definitely very interesting. She gives me some pretty sage advice, and I really enjoyed our conversation. She got up very early to do that because it's a 12-hour time difference. So I was talking at 6:30 p.m. and she was talking at 6:30 a.m. So thanks everybody for tuning in. I hope you enjoy it.
Morning.
Hey, how are you?
Good. How you doing?
Not too bad. I'm packing up, getting ready to leave for a race tomorrow morning.
Oh, wonderful. Exciting.
Yeah, I do triathlon, so it's gonna be about like a 6-hour drive.
Wow. Where is it?
It's in North Carolina, in the middle of nowhere.
Oh, okay. Is it mountainous there?
The west side is. The east side obviously faces the Atlantic Ocean, so you kind of have low country, so it's flatter. But yeah, the west side is the old Appalachian Mountains, so they don't get above Alexa. What's 6,000 feet in meters?
1,828.8 meters.
So nothing taller than 2,000 meters.
Yeah, right. Okay.
We're on the imperial system, which is kind of a pain. Where are you at? You're in.
I'm in Perth, which is.
Oh, you are the most isolated place in the world.
That's right. Yeah.
You are like the largest city that is the most isolated. It is like easier to get to like Buenos Aires than it is to like the other side of the country.
Yeah. It's like 4 hours to get, or more actually, to get to the other side of the country. And to fly, but it's all basically just desert between us and the eastern states.
How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I've moved here about almost 2 years ago now from Sydney, which is one of the bigger cities, and I really like it here. Actually, it's really nice. It's a smaller community, but in terms of the research community and the TBI community, people really kind of pull together, and it's quite tight knit and collaborative, which is great. And it's a great city, beautiful beaches, gorgeous, really nice place.
They have a couple Ironman races there. There's one in Busselton. I think that's where they hold Western Australia.
Yeah, that's our state is Western Australia. Busselton is beautiful.
Yeah, I haven't been there yet, but I mean, I would like to try to do that one day, but it's going to be very expensive for me to get over there. And it's like probably the longest flight for me because I actually don't know which direction I would travel, if I would head east or west. Yeah. I think I head east because then
you can do both. Going, I think it is east if you go through Asia and have a stop through Asia. That can break it up a little bit.
I'm assuming I would go east and there would probably be a stop in like Dubai.
Yeah, those are good. Quick stops in China can be good as well, and then it's kind of two kind of 7-hour flights.
How often do you leave the country for research?
Before COVID, we used to leave, I would say once or twice a year for international conferences. But it is just such a long trip. So we really have to be careful about what we're attending, because it's not like we can just go on a trip for, if we're going for a 4-day conference,
there's money involved.
Yeah, it's quite expensive and it actually takes a few more days. But if we're going, we kind of want to tack on a bit of holiday or something as well to make it really worth our while for that travel.
I guess there's a neuroscience conference this year here in Atlanta where I live.
Yeah, the National Neuroscience Society meeting.
Are you going to come to that?
I'm not, unfortunately. I would have loved to, but in Western Australia, because we are so isolated in Perth, they had a hard border for national and international travel. So we've actually only been allowed to travel interstate for the first time in like 2.5 years, just in basically the last month. So, or internationally, we haven't been allowed to go internationally either.
Because I think COVID, I know a pro triathlete in Australia, he's over in Brisbane, and he says like, yeah, if I can't leave the country to go race because when I come back, I have to have a 2-week quarantine period, and then it's like,
Mhm.
but you have to pay for it too, and it's like,
Mhm.
that's a lot.
Yeah. And you have to stay in a hotel. So you can't leave the
Mhm.
hotel room. They kind of bring the food to you and then leave, and you have to kind of furtively come out the door. So yeah, that's the other reason why we haven't been traveling as well, because it's even going interstate, we would have had to do a 2-week hotel.
Yeah, I mean, you got to leave and use, you get your time. Do you have to use your vacation time for that kind of thing, or is that like
It
expensive?
depends. It really depends on where you work. Universities are usually good about it, although they had banned travel internationally. So, but yeah, some people would have to take vacation time, which really just cuts into it.
So can you explain to me a little bit about your research that you've got going on now? I went through your publications on Google Scholar. They're a little bit above me, and there's actually quite a lot. You do a lot of work.
Yeah, I like to look at TBI from all kinds of different perspectives and use a whole lot of different tools to kind of really understand what's going on in the brain. So at the moment, I've got a couple of projects that I'm interested in and working on that are about acute TBI. So we're trying to predict when someone has a concussion based on their immediate circumstances around their injury and some of their demographic information, their sex, their age, did they have a sports injury or did they have a vehicle accident? And
Can it be
putting that
both?
kind of yeah, so we're looking at people just within 7 days of injury, but we're also taking information about prior injuries as well, because as you probably know, if you've had one head injury, you're more likely statistically to have another one in the future. So we take that kind of information and we combine it with MRI scans. So we're looking at things like white matter, and we're looking at brain volumes, and we're looking at microbleeds and iron deposition, things like that, blood flow in the brain, a whole lot of different imaging related factors. And we're combining that then with things like exercise tolerance, heart rate variability. And what we're doing is then getting all this information in the first week after a brain injury, and then we're following people out for 12 months to try and see what of those initial factors relating to the injury and early sort of pathology or factors around the injury, what we can use to then predict how someone's going to recover. Because we know that from at least the sports literature, about 20% of people will have long-term problems after a concussion. But the literature from more the general population who are older and younger and have different levels of fitness and different diet and things like that, different lifestyles, it could be even up to 50% of people will have problems with their recovery. So we're really trying to predict early on how people will recover, so we can kind of direct people to more appropriate kinds of care to get them early intervention. So we're working a lot on that, and then we're working on longer term consequences of brain injury. So people who've had a brain injury and haven't recovered well and have a lot of ongoing problems, to use things like MRI and quantitative EEG, looking at brain waves to say, what is it that's going on inside their brains, and is there anything potentially we can do about it to try and help reduce their symptoms by changing underlying brain function.
Yeah, so I got my TBI from I got hit by an SUV. Wasn't exactly the most pleasant thing, but I have some of that data you're actually asking for with heart rate from when I started training again. I wear a heart rate monitor. I have it from cycling, running. Oh, so I have some of that data from early on.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So if you know about heart rate variability, then you would know that your heart should beat within a certain range so that you're getting sort of optimal blood flow and cardiac function. But sometimes when people have a TBI, they have trouble reaching that kind of wide range of heart rate variability. So their variability is much more reduced. So that means that they have trouble if they can only have heartbeat in a range of 60 to 70 beats per minute, just say, instead of 50 to 80 beats per minute, they will have a lot more trouble with their exercise tolerance. They'll fatigue much more quickly, and they'll also have more symptomatic provoking when they're exercising. So they'll start to feel very symptomatic, getting dizzy, getting tired, feeling nauseous, that kind of thing. Is that you?
Blurred vision?
Yeah, blurred vision as well. Yeah, absolutely.
Yep, that's definitely the things that I got when I'm, especially when I'm out of shape. I mean, it's harder to get back in shape and it's harder to train longer, but it's definitely the blurred vision and like the lack of endurance. It used to be easier. If I was out of shape prior to my TBI, it wouldn't take all that long to get back in shape, and you lose a lot after that.
Yeah. Yeah, so we've got people, we put them on an exercise bike within the first week after an injury, and we get them to ride, increasing their RPM on the bike. So they're working a little bit harder over time, a little bit harder. And then we see every 2 minutes what their heart rate's doing and how that relates to their symptoms. So we ask them, how hard do you feel like you're working, and what kind of symptoms are you experiencing now compared to just before you started the exercise?
Yeah, I can definitely notice a difference early on. And, you know, I've been off, like COVID for me was, I don't know, I worked on other projects. Like this is something I kind of took my mind off to do, where interview people or the video blog. So coming back to it has been a lot harder to get back into shape and keep my heart rate down. And because I mean, when you're exercising, when you're talking about heart rate, you're basically talking about your baseline when you're not exercising, that kind of thing. Because when I'm in exercising, like I try to stay on a comfortable run between around 150 beats per minute. That's zone 3 for me. So, and I know when like in a race, I'll be getting up over 180, but that's not sustainable. And for me, I could sustain that for longer and a little bit lower when I was before my TBI. And after it's like, it goes higher, it can reach to 190 and it just doesn't last that long, but it's also like a lot slower pace too.
Yeah, it's really interesting. This brain-heart connection isn't something we've really researched a lot before. I think we don't know a lot about how brain injury can affect the heart, but there's starting to become more and more literature now that we're starting to see that people who've had a TBI are having cardiac consequences. So it could be things like, it could be their heart rate. It can be change in the contractility of the heart muscle. It can be changes in the blood flow through the aorta, all different kinds of things like that.
Why do you think there's a connection? I mean,
yeah, I'm not really sure. I think it can be through the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. So that's the fight or flight kind of response. So those are quite connected for brain and heart. So it could be a nervous system response that we're not getting that appropriate activation of the nervous system, or proper balance between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. So we're not activating at the right time to the right extent, and we're not able to bring that down at the right time. So that's probably why it makes it harder to get back into training and get back that fitness as well.
How do you think the role of fear plays into it? Like for me,
that's a really good question.
I mean, you know, obviously the fight or flight response, you know, comes into factor with fear. And for me, the first 2 years and 3 months of my accident, I had 2 major fears that I had to live with every day. I was in a relationship with someone, and I was always in fear that she was going to leave because she had difficulty being with someone with a brain injury. And the other fear I had was that I was going to get fired from my job. And it did happen 4 times, that I just was no longer competent at it. You know, I never took it personally because it's a business, you know, not personal, but I still feared it every day. And the thing is, the one day I got fired on a Monday. So I really did not know when that shoe would drop. I knew I couldn't do the job, but I just didn't know when it was going to come. So I had to live with that. And it was like a heightened state of anxiety. And I don't know what it did to the rest of me aside from my brain.
Yeah, there's a lot of research looking at effects of anxiety on the whole body, and the sort of negative effects of anxiety, and especially living in that kind of prolonged stress state that can really affect all your organs, all your body systems. And it can also be as well, I guess it's a little bit of a vicious cycle with TBI, because the balance between the testosterone ratio and the cortisol ratio, they need to kind of keep each other in check. So you have that, you're not too aggressive with the testosterone, and you're not too fearful or anxious when you have too much cortisol. But we've found in military populations that who've had a TBI, that ratio of testosterone and cortisol changes, and people can go one of two ways. So they can be much more aggressive in one kind of phenotype where they have much more testosterone compared to cortisol, and they become very angry, very aggressive. They have trouble with their impulse control, so they're kind of road raging and things like that. And then they can go the other way, and they can have not enough testosterone and too much cortisol. And that makes them very fearful, very anxious, very on edge all the time, which then also feeds on to impaired sleep, and, as you say, like impaired relationships and that kind of thing as well.
And lower athletic performance.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, that does explain some things possibly. Obviously, I don't have any data on that to confirm it, but it makes a little bit more sense now. But for with my flight or fight response, it was like always engaged, and I feel like it short circuited after a while because, for me, for the longest time, my brain didn't comprehend on how to respond to anything because it was just confused, and then confused led to anger. And it was just that kind of clouded my mind, and it just, I don't know, it kind of short circuited that flight or flight response to where either I was completely fearful or I was angry, and I didn't know how to react. And it was, after that 2.5 years where she left and I went on permanent disability, then I noticed a change. Obviously, I had to kind of work through a little bit of depression and some therapy, but I did notice that with the alleviation of that fear and anxiety that I had, that I actually started to make progress in recovery. I didn't make any progress at all for that first 2.25 years. And, it was once once that boat anchor kind of detached, then I could make some progress on it.
The worst things that could have happened, and you lived with it and moved on. So you can start to rebuild.
Yeah. And I feel like, obviously my athletic performance hasn't quite returned, but, I feel that you could notice a change once your flight and fight response could kind of find a normal baseline again, to where it wasn't always, every day, what's going to happen to me today.
That's as well as physically fatiguing, it's also really mentally exhausting to be living like that.
It is. And it's you're a whole new person afterwards too. But you're not the final person you're going to be. There's like this transition phase, whether it's a concussion or a TBI. Concussion could change you. It's more of a functional rather than a structural damage. But either way, they could change you and your personality. It doesn't mean you're going to be your final phase, though. For mine, it took about 4 years for me to figure out, like, oh, this is who I am. This is my new normal. This is what my life is going to be like.
Yeah, I think that's really difficult for friends and family to understand as well, because they only know you as you were before. And it's quite difficult you articulate it well now, but it's quite difficult to articulate when you're going through that, that you are changing, and it can really impact relationships in ways we don't quite appreciate.
See, I'm gonna give you an example that I always call it, but I don't know if you're gonna understand it because it doesn't snow in Australia, does it?
No, but it does in the mountains, but I used to live in Canada, so I understand a little bit the snow.
So have you ever seen a snow globe?
Yeah.
Okay. So I always say, like, when I got hit by the car and got my TBI, it was like somebody shook the snow globe. The snow goes all up in the air, and when it falls, you don't know how long it's going to take to settle, and it never settles in the same place. So that's what I like to say it was like.
Yeah, that's a good analogy.
And, it's starting to get that forgetfulness, and I would forget where I was headed with it. But, with your research, it's definitely been interesting to see where from what I did understand, because I do have a psych degree, so I can understand at least the basic aspects of research, how it functions, how you collect data and everything, and how to read data. So I can understand some of that, rather, even if the rest of it is above my head. And it does seem like there is promise to it. I don't know if you're familiar with Reddit, but Reddit has a subreddit for TBIs. And a lot of people there are kind of like in hopelessness and despair, but there's not a lot of, nobody throws around a lot of data or anything to show that, yeah, things will get better. Based like everything that we see on the outside, academically, there are showing promise that your life will get better. And once I started like doing these interviews with neuroscientists and neurologists, and aside from seeing my own, I could see that like, oh, okay, my life is going to improve. It may take time, but I understand it better. Like talking to people like you have helped me understand at least the technical aspect and provide myself with some answers that, I guess one of the hardest things about TBI is you're always going to end up with more questions than you do answers, because every time you get an answer, it just leads to a few more questions than you had before.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's so many things we don't know about TBI and TBI recovery that there's just endless questions.
How do you handle that when you come up with an answer in your research and it just leads you to more questions?
Yeah, it is hard to really focus on the kinds of research questions we can answer, because there are so many worthwhile things to research, and so many rabbit holes we can go down. So we try and follow as best we can those kinds of chains of different research questions to, oh, we found this and that's really interesting, and how about that, and how does that work? So one of the things we're looking at the moment, which is a good example of that kind of rabbit hole, is we'd read a little bit about the microbiome and how that can change in TBI, and we're like, wow, that's really interesting. I wonder how that works in repetitive TBI, so concussions but experienced on a kind of repetitive scale. And so we got some poo samples and we did some microbiome analysis on them and found actually there is quite a big change in the microbiome after repetitive TBI, like you'd see in kind of like football players and things like that. So that's kind of led us down to a rabbit hole of, okay, well, how does the microbiome then influence the brain, and how do our inflammatory cells coming from the gut, are they changing? Is the gut wall changing to allow permeability? Cells and their inflammatory mediators and things like that affecting the brain, and how is that route of communication? So we've got now a whole new research program looking at those kinds of things to try and work it out.
So lost that thought again. So when brain injuries, it's not like, first of all, it's an invisible injury. So it's for people on the outside. I've found that if you're not in the medical field or like science fields, first of all, they have trouble just making that connection to your injury. It's not like you want to see that guy walking down the street with a permanent limp because he snapped his leg in half on a doing motocross, right? You could see that, you can make that connection that, oh, this guy had an injury, it could be with him for life, and you can have empathy for that. People don't have empathy for brain injuries as easily, because if they're not in that field, can't make that connection, they can't see it. And part of it being an invisible injury is it can manifest in every single person differently. I don't know how many people you could say, I would venture to say that we are all different in some way.
Yep.
And how do you control that in your research when you have all these different independent variables?
Yeah, that's a great question. So they say in the field, if you've seen one brain injury, you've seen one brain injury, not you've seen one, you've seen them all, because everyone is so different, and everyone's lifestyle, everyone's medical history, age, sex, so many different variables, the way you were brought up, even your coping styles and your resilience, things like that really makes such a difference to your recovery. So it is really difficult to try and tease out, as you say, and control for all those different kinds of variables. So what we're doing is trying to more and more with our research look at people as a group if we're studying them, but also say, okay, well, if we look at a few things that these people have in common, like these people have a really interesting, slightly different response. Let's go back and see, if they had a slightly higher inflammatory marker or something like that. Let's go back and see what we can find about them that makes their data different, rather than trying to say, this is the data we've got on the inflammatory marker and there's a lot of variability in it. So we can say, okay, some people are high, some people are low. What about them is making it that way? So is it their diet? Is it their coping skills? Things like that, to try and tease out more trajectories of recovery.
So when you start to form sample sizes, do you do a lot of survey research to kind of at least limit it down to where you can get to a number to where you can interview people to do further screening?
Yeah, so we don't typically do that. For a lot of our research, especially the research on acute injuries, we need to wait for the people to have their injuries and then recruit them. So we will sort of just recruit a wide range of people there and try and enroll as many people as we can. But we do use larger kind of samples and surveys to refine our interesting questions. So one we've been looking at the moment is a survey that we did, and we started doing it because of COVID. It was difficult to do our in-person research. So we thought, okay, let's do a survey of people across Australia and look at people's factors around their injury, what contributed to what kinds of symptoms they had and what contributed to their recovery. And one of the things we were interested in was to try and find out, where do people go to seek help after they've had a brain injury? Do they go to their local general practitioner, their local doctor? Do they go to the emergency department? Do they go to an athletic trainer or a physio, or do they not seek any care at all? And we were interested in the ones who don't seek any care at all, especially more on the milder end of the injury spectrum with concussions. Are people going, oh, well, it's a concussion, who cares? Or, oh, I'll just wait and see, or I'm not quite sure where to go. So we've got some interesting research coming out of that. So we can then use those kinds of larger samples to refine questions for more specific groups of people.
I know how important twin studies are in science. And the problem is with TBI concussions is it's unethical to give someone a concussion and then study them, let alone two people.
Yeah.
And I actually met a sports neurologist doing this, where she said, yeah, I actually was working in a hospital at one time where two twin brothers who played, American football, both got concussions in the same game, and we wrote a paper on it. I don't know if you've had any experience like similar to that, or any kind of twin studies with TBIs and concussions. I feel like it's such a rarity because you can't ethically create those circumstances.
Yeah, we have not had any twins like that. I would love to happen across a pair of twins and look at their recovery trajectories. We have had, though, in some of our studies, people who are demographically the same. So we have a lot of, in Perth, we have a lot of people who play country football. So they're typically young guys. And we've had people who are very well matched in terms of their age, their education, where they grew up, their lifestyle, their diet. They drink the same amounts of alcohol and eat the same kinds of food and, do the same kinds of socializing, go to university, do similar degrees, things like that. And they've had quite different recovery trajectories, which has been really interesting to see, because based on what we had previously thought, people who were kind of similar in background would, similar age, similar fitness levels, would kind of have the same recovery. But it really just shows you can't predict so easily. Pardon me.
That's all right. So, Doc, let me get you out of here on this one, since I know it's early there. What piece of advice would you give to people like me that I probably haven't heard yet?
Oh, I would say something you probably wouldn't hear from a scientist or a medical practitioner. Be kind to yourself and give yourself the time to discover who your new you is and take the time for your recovery and recognize that the recovery will take time.
So you're telling me to have grace then?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. That's very sage advice, Doc. Well, thank you for joining me today. I appreciate it. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.